Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another edition of Birding 101, Michigan Birding 101. Once again, we are so happy to have you here for another exciting class. This week, I'm joined by my friend Kevin here, a wonderful great blue heron with me at my office at Lake Superior State University. And of course, as always, I'm joined by the amazing, extraordinary Cindy Hudson. So we're going to get going right here, right off the bat. But I first wanted to just remind you that this is a program through Michigan State University Extension. So as you saw scrolling through our screen earlier, we do have a commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion. And so this program is open to all. And also we want to acknowledge that our offices and our lands were once tribal lands, and we want to seek to continue to work with our tribes across the state. So with that being said, we're going to get right into our birding for the week. Hopefully you enjoy this beautiful picture of a pine grosbeak from my friend Sky over in Marquette. And I do want to just give a quick reminder. So we have microphones and cameras off for everyone. The only folks who are going to have their microphones and cameras on are me. So you don't have to worry about that, but you do have a chance to interact through our chat function. So the chat function is down at your bottom of your screen there, and you can chat with folks, share resources. I'm going to ask you questions. You can answer the questions there. But I also want to point out that we have a Q&A, and this is where you should ask your birding questions that we'll get to at the end of the session. We'll take your questions at the end. If you put your questions in the chat, they may get lost. So Q&A for questions and chat for everything else. All right, with that out of the way, we're going to move on. And our objectives for tonight are, one, we're going to have fun. Let's have fun. Let's get some questions answered. Let's see some cool bird pictures like those birds right down there at the bottom. And our second objective for today is identifying some common feeder birds. So last week we covered how to use your binoculars. Hopefully you had a good time with that. Hopefully you've been practicing throughout the week. And now it's a time where we want to start really looking at birds with those binoculars, hopefully right in your own backyard. And so we're going to cover how you can bring birds to your backyard and what those birds might be. And then finally, we're going to cover how to make sure that the birds that are in your backyard are in a safe and productive environment through maybe native habitats and through thinking about some of the risks to birds in your own backyard. So as we get going here, I'm going to introduce myself again really quick. But again, I'm Elliot Nelson. I work with Michigan Sea Grant, as we've had a number of people just join in here. And Sea Grant is a program through MSU Extension, the University of Michigan, and NOAA. And so we help to promote the sustainable use of coastal resources across the Great Lakes by both promoting coastal economies and helping to protect and sustain Great Lakes resources. And so you might be asking, what do birds have to do with the Great Lakes and Sea Grant? That seems like kind of disconnected. But the thing is that birds are really important. And last week we talked about how they can be an economic driver through tourism. We talked about how they can be important for a variety of other reasons, in that they might be ecosystem indicators, and they are also good for our physical and mental health through the hobby of birding. But birds also provide a bunch of services. That's right. Now, they're not going to be handing you, your cheeseburger at McDonald's. It's not that kind of service, but they provide ecosystem services. And so ecosystem services are a whole variety of different things that birds do that help keep ecosystems functioning healthily or even improve them. So this is a seabird colony, and there's studies that show where seabird colonies exist on islands in the ocean, those islands are way more productive in terms of their plant life, because those birds are pooping all over the place, and that poop has fertilizer in it, and that fertilizer is being brought from the oceans, from the fish they eat, and those nutrients are now on the land so that plants can start to utilize those nutrients. Another example of an ecosystem service is that birds provide seed spreading services. So it's estimated that in certain forests, about 90% of all the trees and shrubs that grow there were deposited by a bird pooping again. On a bit of a theme here, but it's actually that bird excretion that has the seeds in it that they may have brought from another area. And in some forests, it's up to 90% of those trees and shrubs came from the birds. Crazy. Last but not least, of course, is another great ecosystem service birds provide. This is a barn swallow, and it's estimated that they can eat 850 insects a day. That's a lot of insects, 850 a day. And so, if you don't like the mosquitoes in your backyard, then try to bring in some barn swallows. They actually really like living on nesting structure, or tree swallows that nest in like bluebird boxes. All right, so that's just a bit about what birds do for us and why Sea Grant's involved with thinking about birds and bird protection, and of course the hobby of birding, which is what we're all about today. So you're probably ready to start identifying birds, getting into your backyard, getting going with it. And you might be wondering, well, how many birds am I going to have to learn? Well, in Michigan, we have a checklist with all the birds we have ever seen, and there are 450 species of birds on that checklist. So that's a lot of species of birds, and you might be thinking, "Hoy vey, how do you learn 450?" But and you never really know what's going to show up. New birds get added every year. This is a white-eared hummingbird. And a white-eared hummingbird is actually a bird of Mexico that barely occasionally ends up in southern Arizona or southern Texas, New Mexico. It's really rare even there. And back in 2005, I think it was, one showed up in just north of Ann Arbor, right, in Whitmore Lake area. So you never know what bird's going to show up. These are called vagrants that get off course. There's all these crazy vagrants that show up. I was able to see like a gray kingbird a couple of years, which is a bird from Florida. It was really cool. But that's not what you're going to see in your backyard, most likely. We really only actually have 237 species that breed in Michigan that actually stay here through the summer or winter and raise their young. So that cuts it down a lot. These amazing things like this bird, you can put it in the chat if you know what this bird is. I haven't had a chance to check the chat in a little while. I know that Cindy's looking at it there for me, but does anybody know what this bird is? This is one of the most iconic birds of Michigan because it is not found anywhere else in the world. It does not nest anywhere else in the world other than Michigan. And I see they're coming through now. It's the Kirtland's warbler. Yes. So the Kirtland's warbler is a bird endemic to Jack Pine forests. And so that's one of our really unique breeders. But again, you're not going to see all the breeding bird species in Michigan because you probably don't have Jack Pine forest in your backyard unless you live in the Grayling, Gaylord kind of area or certain pockets of the Upper Peninsula. So when it really comes down to it, the birds in your backyard, you're really only going to have like 10 to 30 species to worry about. So that actually makes it takes a lot of the pressure off, right, of having to learn 450 different species. And so we're going to focus today on that 10 to 30 species or so that you might actually have in your own backyard. And we'll talk about how to attract them there and how to provide maybe food for them, and then how to, work on some of the identification. And this is, one of those ones that might be in your backyard that I think we covered last week, and that is a dark-eyed junco. So, okay, I want to know really quick, how many people have bird feeders in their backyard? Do you feed the birds? And what's your favorite backyard visitor? So please go ahead and just put in the chat. I'd love to hear what are your favorite backyard visitors that come or that you maybe have seen out your own window? Even if you don't have a backyard, you may probably have a window somewhere in your house, I hope. And what have you seen out that window that you really enjoy seeing? And do you feed the birds? So yes, I feed the birds. And which are some of your favorites? I see we've got some answers rolling in now. Oh, Carolina wren's a beautiful little bird. We've got chickadees and of course the iconic cardinals. Oh my gosh, the chat's just blowing up. We do have a few hundred of you on here tonight. So I just love to see Baltimore Oriole coming in. Squirrels, yes, definitely lots of squirrels. So as you continue to just populate that with just the joy of what you might be able to look out your own window and discover is there. I'm going to keep moving forward, but please keep sharing some of the cool things that you have in your backyards. So, like we talked about, we've got the birds providing ecosystem services for us, and we maybe want to provide something for the birds in return, or just to be able to draw in that 10 to 30 species or so. And so really when I'm talking with birders and a lot of times new birders or birds, sometimes I talk to birds directly. I'm not crazy, but maybe a little bit. Um, people ask me, how do I get those cool birds? Why don't I have birds at my bird feeders? I put something out and all I get are, that one squirrel that shows up, or maybe you do have birds, but then people say, oh, now I have this giant flock of blue jays and they're always so noisy and they're making all this fuss and I don't have any other birds. So how do I keep those pesky ones away? Or how do I, get the ones that I want? And those are kind of the two cruxes of it, right? How do you attract the bird species and a diversity of species? And then how do you kind of deal with some of the conflicts that come up when you start feeding birds? And there's really three kind of answers to that. One is, what are you feeding the birds? And how are you caring for that feed? Two, what are your feeders like? And three, where are you putting this stuff? So let's dive into some of those different things. And again, I love all the stuff that's going on in the chat. And too, anytime, please. You can definitely share in the chat to us, just the panelists. But if you look at that chat, you'll also notice that you can click on the two, right next to two, you can click on that. And you can send it to just the panelists, or you can send it to the panelists and the few hundred attendees we have here. And we encourage you to send it to everyone if you're sharing fun facts or cool stuff. So, all right, with that being said, let's get into it. All right, here we go. This is what you're going to feed the birds. Seeds, most likely that's going to be what you start with, are seeds when you feed the birds. And really, there aren't a ton of types of seeds that you can get at most big box stores or at a particularly bird focused store like Wild Birds Unlimited, where I got these photos from. And if you're going to buy anything, if you're going to buy one kind of seed, you know, which one do you think is the most popular out of these here? These are kind of your most common bird seeds, and I do have peanuts down there on the right too. I just didn't have space to put there, but the most common seeds. So I see a lot coming in. Yeah. There's one seed to rule them all, really. One seed that like almost every bird is like, yes, I want that. I want that in my belly. And that seed, as many of you have said already, is the sunflower seed. So black oil sunflower seeds, which are pictured here, are filled with that little kernel inside that's actually quite big and quite easy to get to. The black oil sunflower seeds aren't that hard to break open. If you've ever munched on sunflower seeds yourself, you just can crack them open really easy with your teeth. And for that reason, and because of how much nut is actually in there and how little effort it takes for the birds to get it, they are big fans of sunflower seeds. There's not too many species of seed-eating birds, your most common backyard birds, that are going to turn their nose up at sunflower seeds. And you can even get them cracked open without shells, which makes cleanup a little easier because you don't have the shells all over the place. And the birds like it even more then. But of course, here's the problem with that. The birds aren't the only ones that like sunflower seeds. You also have deer that love sunflower seeds, and you have raccoons that love sunflower seeds, and you have squirrels and chipmunks that love sunflower seeds. So even if you have sunflower seeds out, you still might be having some issues with not getting the birds you want because certain birds or certain mammals are dominating your feeding station. So you may want to try something else. For me, I actually use corn quite a bit in my yard. So corn is a much cheaper alternative, and it's like a third of the price of black oil sunflower seeds. Actually, sunflower seeds have a shortage this year. So if you go buy them for the first time, they're not normally this expensive. My own feed mill where I get mine, they jumped up $10. They went from 20 to 30, which is a huge jump. And that was because there was a lot of issues with the major places that grow them this year in terms of the weather. So I supplement with corn, which you can't leave out for too long because it will spoil. But the blue jays and my blackbirds and the squirrels love corn, and they will eat even the whole kernel. I actually don't use crushed. I just use the whole kernel stuff. And those blue jays and blackbirds love that. And so then that leaves my sunflower seeds and my feeders a little more available for the chickadees and the nuthatches and some of the other finches I have that I really enjoy. So, thinking about that diversity of feed is really good. So you've got sunflower that almost everything likes. And then you've got corn, which if it's whole kernel corn, you'll probably have bigger birds like mourning doves and blue jays that are eating it, and the squirrels love it. Um, but if that doesn't work for you and you still really are trying to get rid of the squirrels in particular, you may want to try safflower. And safflower is eaten by a lot of bird species, but it's a little more bitter. So from what I hear, squirrels are less likely to eat safflower. And if you have sunflower out, your birds would probably prefer sunflower, but you can kind of switch over to safflower or wean them onto that. And I've heard that's really good. Millet is in a lot of bird seed mixes, and it's also very cheap. But there's not a ton of birds that like the millet. In fact, if you have a mix, like I see some people talking about, if you put a mix, a wild bird mix that has a lot of millet in it and a little bit of sunflower, you'll see that a lot of birds just throw all the millet on the ground so they can get to those sunflower kernels. But the nice thing is that millet is eaten by ground feeding birds. So your sparrows and your juncos and towhees, those birds that like to feed right directly on the ground, they will clean up that millet that got kicked down there. And so that can be a good option to add in for your ground birds. And then finally, thistle is it's a very small seed, and a lot of times I find that almost nothing hits the thistle, and then all of a sudden, especially in the winter, all of a sudden finches will go crazy. So the only thing that really likes thistle, or Niger is actually the plant that it's grown from now, is your finches. So finches love that. So these are your main bird seeds here, though. And if you use a variety of them and put them in different places, that's really going to help you out. All right. Somebody says our dog is the only one who eats the millet. That is that is a conflict, and we'll get to mammal conflicts in a minute. But my dogs eat the corn, and it's always so annoying because they don't like it, but they just eat it anyway. Dogs. Okay. So what about other things that are other kinds of feeds? And so that other category of feeds, which is not seeds, that I didn't really know what category this is. It's just the not seeds. So here's the not seeds feeds that you can also think about throwing in. So one, you can of course feed hummingbird nectar, which is really just all you need is a 3-to-1 ratio of water to sugar. You can boil that and then put that in there. Try to avoid the red dyes. It may be that that's not best for the birds. You can also put out suet, especially in the winter. You can buy pre-made suets, or you can just go to the meat counter of your local butcher and they ask for their beef fat trimmings, and you can literally just hang out the beef fat trimmings. Even some folks up here where I'm in the UP, literally they just put out the rib cage from the deer that they shot in the fall after they've cleaned all the meat out of it, and that rib cage is covered in some sinews and fats, and the woodpeckers peck on that all winter long. Fruit is another option, especially in the summer. People like to put out fruit in spring for the orioles and tanagers. You can really put out any kind of citrus fruit, or also jellies like grape jelly. But you can even put out fruit in the winter for things like robins or bluebirds that might have stuck around. And you can use a dried fruit that you soak in water, as long as it doesn't have any additives or anything extra like that. Or if you really want to get expensive, you can start purchasing mealworms for things that maybe don't normally come to feeders, like bluebirds that really eat, just fruit and insects. And so mealworms can bring a diversity. But of course, starlings and a lot of other things love mealworms too. So you may just spend a lot of money on mealworms to feed starlings. So I see some more stuff going on in the chat there. Lots of really good questions or good comments going on. Remember, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, as the Q&A portion is where we'll get to the questions at the end. If your questions are in the chat, we may miss them. So, all right. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of the types of feeds that you do want to buy. I found this graphic from Wild Birds Unlimited in East Lansing, and this is a little note on what maybe you don't want to buy. So we're just talking about the 99-cent bags of bird feed that they sell at like dollar stores. And if you look at that, you might realize that some of the stuff they put in there is basically not bird feed, or it's things that none of our birds here in Michigan are going to be a real big fan of. So if you see barley, milo, especially oats or wheat in your bird seed, it's really just a cheap filler that they're putting in there, and it's just going to be waste on the ground. So avoid those kind of cheap filler things. and really think more on those seeds and some of those other things we showed earlier. And also, if you want to avoid the mess of all the shells, you can invest or spend your money on a no mess blend where the shells have all been removed already. It's going to be a lot more expensive, but by weight, you're not paying for the shells anymore. So it can kind of come out somewhat even, or maybe only slightly more expensive. And then you don't have all the shell mess that will start to build up as you feed the birds. All right. So moving forward, and I just noticed something really quick in the chat that somebody said that they know that hummingbird seed feed mix is a 4-to-1 ratio, not a 3-to-1 ratio. And yes, you can definitely do a 4-to-1 ratio, especially in the summer. But you can do a 3-to-1 ratio earlier in the spring in particular, because that will be a little more concentrated when those birds are migrating. And so that will really help them out by giving that a little boost of sugar. But then as the summer goes on, draw it back down to the 4-to-1 ratio and it won't spoil as fast. So anyway, all right. We'll move on. And next, so we've talked about the type of feed you could use. And again, really, you can just pick one of those. The more you have, whew, there goes my map back there. The more you have diversity, the better you might be able to avoid conflicts and the more types of birds you can get. But really, if you just have sunflowers, a lot of birds are going to be happy. But the next thing is, where do you put that? So as we talked about, there's some birds that really like to feed right on the ground. Some bird species their native foods are on the ground. They pick off seeds off the ground and they spend a lot of time hiding in shrubs or in tall grasses. And so you may want to put some of your stuff on the ground. This is my feeding station in my backyard. And I actually will just throw a little bit of corn every day on the ground, or a little bit of black oil sunflower seed on the ground. You don't want to throw more than 1 day's worth on the ground because it will spoil pretty fast, especially on the ground. But some birds like to feed right on the ground. Others might like something more kind of mid elevation, like here. So, they might be species that are used to living in shrubs and feeding in shrubs that are kind of mid elevation. I can think of cardinals, for example, really like that mid elevation. So they'll feed at the ground or the mid elevation kind of stuff. Something like this too, my very expensive bird feeder right there that has holes in the bottom to let the water drain out, or something really low like this other really expensive bird feeder I have there. I don't know if you can tell I'm being snarky, but these are just some objects I had that I found I could put birdseed on. And then of course, high elevation stuff. In my front yard feeders, I have a big evergreen tree and I put stuff up pretty high there. And again, too, it's not just the elevation, but what you're putting your feeders next to. So if you have bird species that really like trees, like your nuthatches and your blue jays really like those taller trees, you may want to put those feeders near the habitat that they are accustomed to. Many birds like to perch on a branch, hop over to the feeder really quick and go back to that branch. So if you have tall trees next to your feeders, that can help. Or you might want to put it next to a shrubby area or a tall grass area. You can, of course, most people end up putting it out on their short grass lawn, but of course, a short grass lawn isn't really a native habitat of anything. It's just a human invention where we're like, yay, we like really tiny little plants. So we cut it. But you can put if you have a non-lawn habitat somewhere in your backyard, putting your feeders closer to that may be the best way to go. But also, just the diversity is really, again, if you want to see a lot of species, try putting things in a lot of different places. And if you have your feeders out for a little while and you're really not getting the kind of birds you want, or many birds, try moving them to a new location. Again, those kind of areas where birds have cover, though, is really going to make them feel a little more secure so they can run out, get some feed, and come back, except for something like a giant flock of blackbirds, which might just want to run all over the lawn. All right. I'm going to keep going forward here. All right, next, style matters. Okay, so the style of bird feeder also has an impact on which birds you might get. I can think particularly of the platform feeders. So like the two on the bottom left here, these are kind of more open spaces. And as you saw from my picture before, my platform feeders are a plastic chair that I had laying around and a plastic bucket. It's good. It's better if your platform feeders have some sort of drainage so water doesn't pool in them. Often they're not covered, and so you do want to keep your seeds as dry as you can, or just put enough out that will be gone at the end of the day. But platform feeders are really good for things like grosbeaks. So evening grosbeaks, especially a slightly rare species, becoming more rare in Michigan, really likes those kind of open platform feeders. Mourning doves will either feed on the ground or like those kind of larger platform feeders. But another kind of feeder is the tubes. So tube feeders are really great for finches, chickadees, nuthatches will like the tube feeders as they like to crawl vertically on things. And then you'll have feeders with hoppers, which are really nice and convenient as long as a squirrel doesn't get inside of there, which they're really good at doing. These are feeders that then you don't have to fill as often because they have a closed in area where the seed will stay dry and it will slowly come out as the birds eat more of it. So it's nice to have a few hoppers, especially if you don't want to go out and fill your feeders every day. And then for the thistle or Niger seed I was talking about, you really have to have a special feeder for that since that seed is so small. And so they sell basically, they call them socks. And that's really just for one kind of feed. The others might be for a variety. And then you can also get wire cages that are attached to your bird feeders or that go up against a tree to put your suet into. So again, though, just trying to drive home the point that there's a wide variety. You don't have to have all of these things. If you want a diversity of species, try using a variety of feeders. And, as I showed you, you really don't have to spend a lot of money on fancy feeders. I was just doing a 4-H birding club with kids, and, we were doing the old pine cone feeder thing, and that works great. Roll a pine cone in peanut butter and then roll that in seeds, and you just have created a totally biodegradable native plant that you can then put out as your bird feeder. Or you can use an old chair like I did. So yeah, again, the key is diversity and thinking about where to put these in a diverse set of areas with, maybe a diverse set of seeds, but also do what works for you. All right, so I'm gonna share just a couple minutes of one of the coolest videos from a really awesome YouTuber who's an or who used to be a NASA engineer. And I'm going to show you why what I was talking about with diversity and conflicts a little bit. So I'm going to stop the share for just a second. Okay, so let's take a look at this and see what's happening here.
This is a bird feeder, and everything to my left is my attempt at...
Oops. Sorry about that.
Making it squirrel proof. If they want the bird seed, they will first need to pass through what is basically an 8-part Ninja Warrior obstacle course for squirrels. This course is extremely challenging. It is not for the timid of heart. But out of the gate, I will admit that in hindsight, that I completely underestimated my adversary. Now, if you're wondering why I would go through all this trouble, we need to go back 8 weeks ago when I found myself stuck at home and very bored. So I installed a bird feeder and decided to become a bird watcher. And it was just so lovely. Until they showed up. Now luckily my bird feeder had a wire cage around it big enough for the birds to slip inside, but small enough to prevent the squirrels from getting the food. And that worked really well until right here. For me, this was like the moment in Jurassic Park when they realized the velociraptors can open door handles. And once the door was open, it was clear this wasn't their first rodeo. They basically cleared this whole tube of birdseed by the end of the day. Mind you, this bird feeder was advertised as being squirrel proof, so I bought another squirrel proof bird feeder to replace it. It's got this outer cage suspended by some springs, and so if a bird comes and lands here, it doesn't weigh that much and it has access to the seeds. However, if a squirrel comes, they'll grab onto this cage, its weight will force the springs down, thereby preventing access to the seeds. I have no idea how the squirrels could possibly outsmart this, but let's see. And this one worked exactly as intended. You can see the birds love it, but when the squirrel comes along, the cage shifts down and now all the seed ports are covered up. Every time they tried, it was the same results. However, the next morning, this guy manages to unclip the springs that hold the cage up, which means the cage stays in the lowered position where it blocks all the seed openings. Problem with that is now they can get to the lid. But this bird feeder lid doesn't hinge open to give direct access, so he goes with a different tactic, where he now has access to all the birdseed he wants. And so
All right. So I highly recommend going checking out that video. It's a great little kind of deep dive into how really good squirrels are at getting into any squirrel proof situation that you try to set up. So people spend many hours trying to get the squirrels to not get their bird seed because they prefer to feed the birds instead of the squirrels. There's really nothing wrong with feeding squirrels, but so
I decided I would
so that, it's just an example, and we'll send a link to that video. It's 22 minutes long. If you saw at the start, he ends up making a giant squirrel obstacle course. It's super entertaining. Definitely go watch it. But this brings up one of the points that I've kind of been cutting back to every time, which is when you feed the birds, one of the main things you have to do is think about the conflicts that you might end up having with mammals. So squirrels, are manageable. You could just kind of resolve to feed the squirrels. That's what I've done. I just try to feed them corn because it's not quite as expensive as the black oil sunflower seed. But, you can also run into conflicts with things like deer. And feeding deer is actually can be illegal in some places due to chronic wasting disease, and can really be destructive to your bird feeders. And so you also might run into issues with raccoons or possums or things like that. So, with the squirrels, you could just try to set up a variety of feeders to give them somewhere else, or you can try to squirrel proof things. With these other ones, if you really have repeated incidences with these other mammals, the best thing to do is to take your feeders down for a few weeks. Hopefully those mammals will move on to somewhere else, and you will avoid that kind of conflict and destruction, especially with bears. If your feeders, we talked a little bit about it last time, if your feeders get hit by a bear, or if you're in a bear area, you may just want to take them down in the spring. But if your feeders definitely get hit by a bear, take it down, because if you fill them back up, that bear will come back, and they are very destructive, and you don't want to run into a conflict with bear. Pesky birds are another example. Some people get inundated with this species here, which is a European starling. Obviously, it's not from North America, it's from Europe. And these species fly in huge flocks, and they can clean out a feeder really fast. So again, either taking your feeders down for a little bit or trying to find places to feed those birds, and then providing kind of more niche areas for your smaller birds is another kind of way to go at it. And then finally, adjustments you may need to make, particularly at the time of year. So having liquid nectar out is probably not a great idea in the winter when it's going to freeze. And then also having your suet fats out, especially in the really warm months of the summer, those can rot, and you really don't want to feed the birds rotten food. And so you may want to pull your suets in the summer, or only leave them out, small amounts that'll be used up quickly. So. All right, keep those questions coming. We will get to them pretty soon here. But the next thing is, what will you find in your backyard? So we've talked about attracting the birds a whole bunch, but now it's time to talk about what those birds will be. So this is one of our birds from last week, and I want you to really quick put in the chat. Let's do a quick review of what we had last time. What are some features that you notice about this bird? So put in the chat, what are some neat features that you notice about this bird? And remember, we're looking for things like structure, patterns that we find on that bird, and relative size is what we can kind of tell from a picture. And you may know some of the behaviors. So I'm seeing coming through the chat now, it has a longer, skinnier beak. It has that kind of two-tone, very bright white on the bottom and darker on the top. Yeah, I'm seeing some stuff about the tail. It's a very short tail, and that's a great thing to pick up. You can identify these even in flight because they have such a short tail. And so you can put in the name now if you know the name of this species. But those were great features that when you're birding, you notice those features, you write them down as quick as you can, or you'll hold them in your head, and then you open up your field guide like I have my National Geographic here, and I would go to the nuthatch section because yes, this is a white-breasted nuthatch. So this is the first group of birds. I'm going to cover a couple groups of birds that you might see in your backyard. These are not taxonomic groups. They're just the names that I came up with for the way I grouped birds. So please know these aren't necessarily taxonomic groups. They're just groups that I find helpful for thinking about the birds. So this is a member of what I call the cute ones. So the chickadees, the titmice, and the nuthatches, and also the creeper here. So these are some of the most common feeder birds you might end up with. Tufted titmouse, I will preface, is only found in the lower peninsula, although their range is slowly expanding north. So we may have them in the UP someday, but they are not super migratory. None of these species are not really migratory, at least not in the way that a hummingbird or oriole is. And these are the little tiny ones that really like sunflower, but will eat other stuff. Brown creeper is one that you might actually not notice because they almost blend in perfectly, but they do actually feed on suet from time to time. I have one that comes to my suet pretty regularly, and they're very, very good at blending in. If this was just from the back, you might not notice it at all. But another cute one that's kind of related to nuthatches, but in its own family. All right, so good job with that one. Those are the cute ones. All right, how about this one? Maybe throw out some features and just identify it right away if you can. What is this bird here? This is a great species of the winter months. All right, I see some answers coming through. Yellow warbler is a good guess there, but yes, what's coming through is an American goldfinch, and this is a goldfinch in its winter plumage. So it's not the bright yellow you may have been expecting from the summer. The males in particular in the summer are very bright yellow, but this is in its winter plumage. And you can see that nice kind of triangular, almost like a perfect triangle beak. And these are the big beaks. I call them the big beaks, but they're just the finches. So this is some of the finches, particularly a goldfinch is probably our most common one. Pine siskin somewhat common. Now we have two here that I want to go into real quick because this is a common ID conundrum here. We have two finches on the right, finch 1 and finch 2. And you might just look at this picture and go, well, those are the same birds, right? Be careful. There's some differences here. See if you can pop in the chat. What are some of the differences between these two birds? They're very subtle, but once you start to notice them, you'll be able to identify these two somewhat easily. So one person put in right away chest streaking, and that's one of the keys to this. Color, this kind of is reddish. One is sort of reddish and 2 is sort of purplish. But I will say when you're in the field and looking at this, especially if you don't have them side by side, red, reddish purple versus purplish red can be pretty tough. But the side streaking on this bird is very fine and pretty dense. Notice the side streaking on this bird over here. There's a few streaks, but they're not as prominent. And there's also that red wash all the way through here. Some of the other things I'm seeing is there's a red wash on this bird's back and rump, but on this bird, it is brown. And then one of the other key features is actually, this is really a little harder to tell in the field, but the shape of the bill here has a slight curve on the culmen, whereas this one is straight, that line between the two. And so if you know what 1 and 2 are, you can put it in the chat. I see some people guessing right already, which is great. Bird 1 is a house finch, which is arguably the more common of the two house finch and purple finch that we have. And bird 2 is the purple finch. So purple finch is a little more common farther north in Michigan, although in winters, sometimes you'll find them all over the state. So that's the house and purple finch. And then finally on the bottom left there, we have, again, 2 species, the redpolls. One is the common redpoll on the right, and the bird on the left is the hoary redpoll, which is pretty rare in Michigan, but that's the redpolls. Okay, we got to keep things moving. All right, so one more kind of bird ID here. So I'm going to stop sharing again for a second. So I have with me a couple bird skins from LSSU. These are birds that died naturally, but their skins are preserved. So here we go. We've got 2 birds that look very similar in terms of their pattern, right? The pattern on these birds is, just black and white. This one's a little roughed up here, but these are actually 2 different species. And if I put them right next to each other, you'll notice, okay, yeah, this bird's a lot smaller than this bird. But I will say the smallest version of this one and the largest version of this one can be very close in size. So what we have here, some people have started to put it in the chat. We have a hairy woodpecker here and a downy woodpecker here. Aside from the size though, so let's say you didn't see these side by side crawling right next to each other. What if you just saw this one first and then you saw this one at a different time and can you tell the difference in size? Maybe not necessarily if you don't have them side by side and things are a little closer or farther. So I'm seeing some people put in the comments already what the big tell is when you don't have these side by side, and that is the beak length. So the beak length of a hairy woodpecker is almost as long as its head, or even in this case, almost slightly longer than its head. The beak length of a downy woodpecker is maybe half the length of its head. And so that's what we're talking about with relative size with the bird identification. When you have when you can compare the bird's feature against itself, you don't need both species side by side. You can tell that that long bill that's just as long or maybe even longer than the head compared to this tiny bill that's maybe only half the length of the bird's head. And so that's one of the ways you can work on those identifications. All right. So again, these are the hard heads, the woodpeckers. There's not too many. They're very unique. So you'll probably see one and you'll go, oh yeah, I know that's a woodpecker because it's crawling horizontally. The only other ones that do that are nuthatches, but they're pretty much a long stretched out body. These birds do have a definite head area and a body area. The head is kind of 90-degree angle from the body as opposed to a nuthatch, which might just be straight. And we've got the northern flicker, which is more common in the summer, but found in the winter too in a lot of places in Michigan. We have the hairy and the downy woodpecker. We have the pileated woodpecker, and we have the red-bellied. There's a few other woodpeckers, but these are probably the most common ones you're going to see at your feeders. All right. Next, it's time to the chunkers. All right, I call these ones the chunky fellas. This is definitely not a taxonomic group, but these are the larger passerines. Passerines are an order of birds, the perching birds. So that's all the birds pretty much that we're talking about today. But these are the largest ones you're going to have at your feeder. So you got the blue jay, these noisy guys. They're kind of chunky, and they're definitely a larger bird with that big crest. You've got oh yeah, there's some fluff boys right there. That's the northern cardinals. You got the red male and the brown female, pretty distinct. American robin, okay, yep, we got that one down probably. And then of course, the chunkest of them all, the mourning dove. Really actually a beautiful bird with a nice little iridescence on it. Kind of slower bird, doesn't move much, but these are large birds that are pretty easy to ID. Hopefully you can pick up on those ones quickly. There's not a lot to confuse those with. All right, how about this one here? I'm just gonna ask for ID right away. Who can get it in there the fastest? What kind of bird is this? Oh yeah, there we go. It's coming in. All right, some of you are definitely not beginning birders, or you've been doing it at least a little while, even if you consider yourself, a beginning birder. So this is the indigo bunting, and this is one of the boys of summer. So there are certain backyard birds that do come to your feeders, but you will only see them in the summer months. Of course, they're not all boys. I'm just thinking of that, saying. Anyway, so you've got the indigo bunting. And actually down here on the bottom right is another one. And I just wanted to point that out, that they don't always look that brilliant blue. In fact, in the dark, if there is a dark lighting, they may almost look black because that's really an iridescent blue as opposed to a true blue. And so that is an indigo bunting down there on the bottom right. But you have hummingbirds. We really only have one species of hummingbird, so that makes that easy. Rose-breasted grosbeaks. I'll talk about a couple other grosbeaks that we have in the winter, but the rose-breasted is the one that we have in the summer. And so the males and females look a little different. And then the Baltimore Orioles. All right, so there's the boys of summer for you. Just gonna give you an overview here. All right, this bird is one that I get a lot of questions about, where many folks are asking, I've never seen this before. What is that? That is such an interesting bird. And so if you know what this is, put it in the chat real quick. Let's see what guesses we have there. Don't worry, wrong guess is totally fine. We're not here to be right. We're just here to learn. So let's see. Yeah, okay. So people are guessing in the actual family or kind of the group of birds. I see somebody guessed a young robin, and that's a really good guess and brings up a good point in that young birds really do look different. So, focus on the adult birds for now, but as you get more advanced in your birding, do start to study your field guide and look at what young birds look like. But a lot of people are guessing something in the blackbird family, and that is the right guess because this is actually a red-winged blackbird. And so that's a female red-winged blackbird. Like you can see down here, here's another one. And we don't see the females very often because they are off hiding, raising their young. The males are the big old flashy ones that are out there defending their territory and making a lot of noise and going all over the place. Typical male. Anyway, the females though are more dull so that they can be camouflaged to care for the young. And so you don't see them or they're not as obvious, but you can still note that the blackbirds have this kind of very distinct dagger-like bill, and that helps you kind of narrow in on at least things like common grackles, rusty blackbirds, which are only in the kind of migration season, and red-winged blackbirds. Cowbirds are another type of blackbird, but they have a more triangular bill, and they're a little more stubby overall. Grackles have these really long tails with the kind of boat shape to them. They're actually kind of spoon shaped almost, whereas the true blackbirds like Rusty and Redwing have more of a spade shaped tail. And so that's a good way to go at that. Eye color can sometimes help, but the younger birds might have dark colored eyes, and so really focusing on that tail shape with these birds is really helpful, and kind of overall structure is what you're going to really be looking at. They can be a little tricky, and there is another one I didn't put on here, Brewer's blackbird, that's really fairly rare in most of Michigan. So these are the main ones you're going to want to go after. And again, that for the grackle, it's that scoop-shaped tail. When you see them fly, you'll really see that scoop. Those middle feathers are lower than the side feathers, whereas the club-shaped tail of a redwing or rusty blackbird is going to be a really good way to differentiate there. All right. So moving on, I'm not going to get into the LBBs, the little brown birds, but this is a image from Richard Eden, who created an app called Birdface. I touched on this last time. We saw the similar drawing from Greg Neese, and this kind of gives you a way to focus on the faces of sparrows, because sparrows can be really tough. But if you start to kind of learn the patterns, like chipping sparrow has a rusty cap, a white eyeline, and then a black eyeline, versus say a American tree sparrow that has a rusty cap, a gray eyeline, and then a rusty eyeline, you can start to pick up on those subtle differences. And if you have questions specifically about certain sparrows and how to ID them, definitely put those into the Q&A section. Again, reminder, that's where to put questions, and we'll try to get to those in a few minutes here as we wrap up. So a couple last few groups. This one here, I'm just going to move right on. These are the flying rats. Okay, that might be a little derogatory, but a lot of people compare the rock pigeon to the rat of the sky. That's maybe not super fair. They are quite a beautiful bird, and they can be trained to be the carrier pigeons that you may have heard of before. But these are kind of some of our most common ones, especially in urban and suburban areas or really close to ags and farms. And these are three species that have adapted to live alongside humans. The house sparrow in particular is really only found around human structures. And all three of these are non-native species that kind of get categorized as the pests a lot of time, and they can be somewhat harmful. It's kind of debatable if you want to call these invasive species or not. They can be, a little destructive sometimes to the native species nests, but these are going to be some of your common feeder birds that you're going to see. So it's still important to learn how to identify them. House sparrows are an old world sparrow, so they're not super closely related to most of our native sparrows. And the males and the females do look different again. Kind of keying in on that male-female differences, it is important to kind of learn about both of the sexually dimorphic species where the male and the female look different. Starlings and pigeons, they pretty much look the same, male and females, but the female house sparrow can often be a tricky one because it's pretty much just dull brown all over. All right. Last but not least, I'm going to try to wrap up here in the next couple of minutes. So it's really great to feed the birds, but if your bird feeder station and your kind of goal for feeding the birds doesn't include safety of the birds, then you may want to consider, not doing it, right? We want to make sure that we're not harming the birds through our different feedings. So there's a few tips on how to make sure that your backyard area or your backyard feeding station is not going to be harmful to the birds. One of the first ones is to just clean. So you do need to clean your feeders from time to time. Dump out any seed that may be falling in there. Use a mild bleach spray to sanitize them on a fairly regular basis. Let them dry out before you put them back out. Really, moisture is one of the things you want to really avoid. And then kind of that hulls, the shells that can build up. Those can build up like pretty thick if you're feeding a lot of birds, those black oil sunflower seed shells. So you want to rake those away so they're not, they'll kill your lawn if you don't rake them up. But you'll also want to make sure that they're not building up to like a nasty rotting mess. So clean, keep it clean. Same with storing your seeds, keep them dry, don't store them on the ground if you have a waterproof container or something to put them in. And then, just be aware of the snake oil salesmen that might be out there. I've seen a number of really odd, like deterrents for certain birds or like woodpecker deterrents. And some of these might be actually really harmful to native species or even illegal. It's illegal to kill or harm a native migratory bird species protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty. So you have to be really careful if you are trying to get rid of birds, because exterminating them may actually wind you up in some trouble. The only ones that aren't protected are those invasive or non-native ones, the pigeon, the starling, and the house sparrow. And so, just be aware of those things. Next is a little bit of a touchy one, but I'm just going to say it. Outdoor cats kill more birds than almost anything else in North America. So it's estimated somewhere between 1 and 5 billion birds every year are killed by cats in North America. And as much as we love Fluffy and we enjoy our cats, it is safest not only for the birds, but also the cats to keep them indoors. Outdoor cats are essentially a non-native predator that is going to be attacking birds. Even if you feed your cat, their instincts are to hunt. And so they will be killing birds. And so the best thing to do is to keep your cats indoors. And you can use a little catio, which is like a little cat patio, or you can use a cat leash if you really think they need to go outside. But especially if you're getting a cat for the first time, the best thing is to keep them indoors. There's a growing body of research. The first kind of paper that came out around how many birds cats kill was quite stunning, but there's continuing evidence to show that that really is holding up. And so keep your cats indoors, please. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now. The next big risk you have are your windows. Birds can't really tell that that's a window. That's not something that's in their evolutionary biology to understand, and so they hit your windows quite often. And so it's a really fairly easy thing to fix. They sell a wide variety of different things you can put on your windows that help break up the reflection. I just use, in general, normally at my house, decorative window clings. We have them for each different season, and we put them up. It's best if they're on the outside of the window, and that will help prevent window collisions or window strikes. This is a huge issue in cities where you can literally go around in the spring and see all the dead birds around a skyscraper, especially those with reflective glass. So really encouraging any new developments to have bird safe windows and to make sure your own windows are bird safe. And then finally, pesticides. Insecticides in particular have caused major declines in things like purple martins and other insect-eating species. So avoid using those like grub killers for your lawn. Avoid using insecticides, even to some degree the herbicides like Roundup and things like that. Those are going to impact the bugs that are on those plants, and then that's going to move up the food chain to the birds. So if you can keep it natural, that's the best route to go. All right, I'm going to share one last thing, and then we'll get to our Q&A time. This is a video from Doug Tallamy about how you can not only not do certain things in your backyard, but you can actually add things to your backyard to make natural food sources. So let's give this a watch.
The ability for ecosystems to function in our managed landscapes, in our suburban-urban matrix, is very poor because we have landscape primarily for looks. We've treated plants as if they were decorations and forgotten all about their ecological roles. So we've sacrificed the ability of all of the land that we've used for our suburban neighborhoods to make ecosystem services that not only support other creatures, but they support us as well. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing the research we're doing. We're trying to generate enough data to convince people that these landscapes can be highly productive. If you produce plants that insects cannot reproduce on and develop on, you are creating a really depauperate ecosystem. What this homeowner has done is put the plants back into this suburban landscape. Most of these plants are indigenous. They are native to this area, which means they are important components of the food webs that originally were in this area. So you have lots of wildlife around, and these plants are filtering our water, they are sequestering carbon, they're supporting food webs, they are supporting the pollinators that keep those plants around, they're producing oxygen. All of the ecosystem services that plants provide are now happening right in this yard because it's not one vast lawn. When I think of best plants, I think of what those plants are doing, and in almost every instance, oaks come out on top. In our region of the country, the mid-Atlantic states, oaks support 534 species of caterpillars. And remember, the birds are eating those caterpillars. So that's 534 species of bird food coming from the oak in your front yard. There's no other tree that does it better. Just for comparison's sake, if you had a ginkgo in your yard, which is from Asia, it supports one species of caterpillar. So there's a huge difference in the productivity of these particular trees. I care about this because we need these other living things to run the ecosystems that we depend on as humans. So we can think of this as, we're not making a sacrifice here, we are doing what's absolutely necessary to keep the ecosystems running that support us. So it's for humans.
All right, folks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. I had the privilege of being able to listen to Doug at a talk at a conference in Michigan a while back, and just that stat that he shared, you know, that you know, you could have a tree that has 500 different species of bird food in your own backyard if you choose to plant native. So you know, I can't say that my yard's perfect or as lush and as massive as some of those. I got a lot of kids and it's a little hard to kind of put that effort into gardening, but it's actually a lot easier than it used to be with things like coneflowers and black-eyed Susans and all these different kinds of different sorts of native species that are more accessible now than they used to be ever before that you can put in your own yard. So with that, you know, we're going to get to our Q&A time now. If you want to learn more about bird feeding and how to make your yard a better place for birds, there's a lot of great books out there. You can also check out, I know some people shared in the chat, Talmage has some great books about native planting. The Joy of Bird Feeding from Jim Carpenter, the founder of Wild Birds Unlimited. We have a number of these stores around Michigan. That is a great book for really getting into the weeds on how to do the best job at feeding the birds. And with that, we'll stay on a little bit longer since I only left about 5 minutes for questions here, but we'll stay on a little bit past to take your questions. So what questions have been coming in, Cindy?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elliot. I could listen to you talk birds all night long. So yeah.
Be careful. I probably could talk birds all night long.
We're going to go a little bit long, and people, we understand if you have to jump off, but we will be, we have been recording this, of course, and you can always just fast forward to the Q&A if you had to jump off early. If you want to stay on, we welcome you to do so. Hey, here's the first question, Elliot. It's actually mine. So are mealworms, I've never used mealworms. Are mealworms dried or are they alive and squiggly?
You know, I actually have never used mealworms either, just probably partially because of the price point, but they are generally dried from my understanding. So if you order them online or something, I'm not sure if they sell live ones somewhere, but
someone in the chat says they do have both.
They do have
Well,
both.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, but I'm getting the dried ones then, because
Yeah,
that
and
just
you
kind of
may
grosses me out.
you may want to be really careful too if you're ordering a live insect. You may want to really make sure that it's not going to become an invasive species, because even some things that you can order online, they won't tell you that it may be banned in Michigan. Like, for example, you can order red swamp crayfish from Louisiana. You can order them online. They'll ship it to you in Michigan. It is illegal to have a live red swamp crayfish in Michigan because it is an invasive species. So same thing if you're buying insects online, or even from a store, make sure if it's live that it's not going to become invasive.
Excellent point. That's an excellent point. Someone asked, and I don't actually usually think of these as backyard birds, but for somebody's backyard, they would be. How do you draw purple martins to your yard? So what's the best type of a habitat for a purple martin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So purple martins are an amazing species of swallow, a very large type, and they are really in serious decline. So they used to be all over Michigan, but they are dependent pretty much on human homes. And so you don't attract purple martins through feed typically. You attract them by putting up martin homes. And one of the best resources we have in Michigan is the Michigan Audubon Society's Purple Martin Conservation Initiative. So this is a picture of a purple martin here. And their conservation initiative is actually trying to track these. And people that are really into purple martins basically put up these homes for them and care for these homes. And you can see purple martin colonies are found both along the lakes and inland, but they do tend to be near water areas, and they are insectivores. So again, the best things you could do for purple martin, one is to put up a purple mountain home. And again, check out the Purple Martin Conservation Initiative at Michigan Audubon for tips on that. And then the second thing is, again, don't use insecticides. Purple martins need insects. And we use so much insecticide these days that it's really starting to cause the extinction of this species. So those are the two things you can do. Promote native habitat, I guess would be a third one. Don't use insecticides, and put up the homes.
Awesome. Hey, since we talked a lot about feed and feeders, how often should a feeder be emptied and cleaned? And how do we know if seeds have turned bad?
I hesitate to give exact answers on those things because there's a lot of variables. Like I said before, if your seed is getting wet, if it rains and you have seed that's open and not covered, or if your feeder leaks, you probably want to change that out on a daily basis if it's getting wet. That's why, like, when I put out my corn, corn especially can turn in a day or two and can get a fungus that can actually kill birds. So you really, especially in the summer, don't want to put out more than a day's worth of corn. But I would just say, there's no, in the winter months, you may be fine for a long time with, say, your black oil sunflower seed hopper out there. It's not going to be as wet and it's going to be cold, so mold's going to be harder to grow. And so, you really just want to check your feeder regularly, look at the signs of what's going on. If it's wet and it seems damp and things are clumping, get rid of that seed, throw it out, dry it out, and refill it. But I'm not going to say exactly how long. And then there was a second part of that question. I don't remember now.
Oh, great. I'm sorry. I've moved on to another role.
Okay. Well, we'll just move on to the next one. I need some dinner, I think.
Dang it. I missed that. I can't find it now. Oh, well, it's in the pile of stuff. When do you start feeding for orioles and to come to your yard?
Yeah. So for the orioles, April is probably when you might want to start putting out that stuff. Again, you have to be careful with how long you leave those out, especially fruit or nectar can start to rot. But you could start putting it out in April, and then definitely by May is when you're going to start to really see those things pop up. Same thing with hummingbirds. You can put it out in April, and you can actually leave it up through October, because we do get these late. Occasionally, most of the hummingbirds are gone in September, but sometimes we get these weird late ones that stick around in October, November, even sometimes. And some of those end up being those really rare ones, like that white-eared hummingbird I was talking about. We had a Barrelin hummingbird, which was another super rare one that showed up in October in Grand Marais. So leaving those hummingbird feeders out later, as long as you keep them clean, is away you
Yeah,
go.
and we'll hunt it up so we can send it out in the resources. But I often track through the Hummingbird map. There's a website you go to, and because they track first sightings all the way up through the entire migration, because there's a big difference between honestly when a hummingbird will show up in Ann Arbor, and then when it'll show up in Lansing, and when it'll show up in Grayling, and when it'll show up in Sault Ste. Marie. So you can actually watch these maps, and I have tracked when hummingbirds have first arrived at my house, and so I have done that for several years, so I can pretty much guarantee that it's going to be in this X amount of time period that I need to make sure I get my Hummer feeders out. So has this been a harsh winter for birds, do you think?
So, it's actually been a really mild winter for most of the winter in terms of temperature. We actually had quite a few species that migrate kind of based on food availability or even temperature that were really sticking around for longer than normal. I had blackbirds, grackles in particular, that stuck around through all of December in my house in the UP, and that's really unusual. So we had a milder winter, which can be somewhat good for the birds. But what is really kind of problematic is that we are seeing wild shifts in our winters, and that's really due to climate change. And that's, birds are acclimated and evolved to handle what the normal weather patterns were. What really messes up birds is when we have these really early, maybe melts in like February or something, and then, maybe things might start hatching, bugs might start coming out, but then we get that cold snap again in March because it's really not supposed to be that warm in February, and that kills off all those bugs. And now when our migratory species show up in May expecting those bugs, those numbers may be way lower. So it's that irregularity that throws off what we call phenology. And climate change is one of the biggest issues that birds are facing these days because it's throwing off their phenology. What they're evolved to be used to isn't happening anymore. And so that's really, we do have really harsh winters, really cold winters, and that can be hard on certain birds like waterfowl especially, but it's the irregularity that's really messing up a lot of our songbirds.
What do you think of window feeders? I know you and I've talked about that earlier today.
We did. I don't know if we came to a conclusion. I've read some. I'm not a bird feeder expert. I've only owned a house for about 4 years now. And prior to that, I didn't feed the birds because I was hopping around in different apartments and stuff. So I have never had window feeders. I've read some stuff that says having your feeders really close to your windows is okay because then the birds don't have enough speed to like leave the feeder and hit the window. But I've certainly seen lots of them. I would say consult your local Wild Birds Unlimited or check out some birding resources online to get an answer to that, because I don't want to answer it because I just don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to put my opinion out there, and that again, just my opinion. But I've had both window bird feeders, that are like the ones that have like the suction cup that attach to the window for the little birds. They work fine. But I also did it one time for hummingbirds, and that I really found to be a problem because hummingbirds are incredibly territorial. I mean, they're not sweet little birds. You watch them; they can be pretty wicked to each other, and they will get very territorial and see themselves in the glass, and then that can actually cause a problem with that. So, just my opinion, but
yeah, I mean, window strikes is definitely an issue. So if you do have and then of course like aggressive behaviors like seeing reflections, so using those deterrents on your window is helpful.
And just regarding hummingbirds and filling your nectar feeders, you really need to keep your nectar feeders clean. So you should be changing those out at a minimum. I would think in the really hot weather, you should probably be doing it every day. And that's when we get the high 80s and 90-degree weather, you might want to think about doing it every day or every other day. And then when it's colder, you can go a couple of more days. And I wouldn't fill a feeder necessarily all the way unless you already have hummingbirds coming, because you just waste feed that way because you'll just have to throw it out anyway. Any other thoughts on that, Elliot? Okay. And then I love this question here. So I'm truly a beginner birder and I'm interested in learning about them. The only thing I've fed the birds is bread of all sorts. Is it dangerous for the birds?
I can't say exactly what the impact of bread is on songbirds, but I do know that bread is definitely harmful to waterfowl. And my guess would be that it's probably also can be harmful to songbirds. What can happen is if they eat too much bread on a consistent diet, it can mess up the protein growth of their feathers and cause disfiguration of their feathers and prevent them from flying or being able to swim. I can't say I know exactly for songbirds, but I do know for waterfowls, you don't really want to feed them bread. So I would be hesitant to do that for your songbirds as well. The other thing, by putting out bread, you're really going to then put out something very attractive to mammals, particularly raccoons and possums and skunks. They're really going to be drawn to that too. So you're just kind of asking for trouble with that. I would probably say in general avoid it, although you can definitely do some research to see if I might be wrong, but I know it's not good for a lot of animals, so my guess is probably not good for most of the birds.
And you mentioned feathers, so is it illegal to save feathers?
So under the Migratory Bird Treaty that I kind of referenced earlier, it's illegal to have to harm a bird or to disrupt it from its nesting or regular cycles. It's illegal to kill it, and it's illegal to take parts of the bird. So technically, yes, it is illegal to have migratory bird feathers and or ones that are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty. The three that aren't, that I referenced earlier, is the rock pigeon, the European starling, and the house sparrow. You can have their feathers. And the logic behind this is that Migratory Bird Treaty came at a time where birds were going extinct left and right because the feather trade for hats was out of control and everybody in London wanted a feather in their cap, like literally. And so they were being hunted left and right for their feathers. And even today, we still have bird poaching issues. And so, yeah, that is why that is there. And it is technically not legal to have those feathers. So
Is blue jay a migratory bird then?
It is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty. So
I might have to
the
change
migratory
some of my bird stuff out.
well, yeah. I'm not going to
I do know that having an eagle feather is very, very bad. Don't ever have an eagle feather.
Yeah, there are additional laws that protect raptors and then even more that protect bald eagles. So you're really getting into trouble then. So.
Yeah. Well, we could go on and on, but we can't. So I'm gonna pull us to a close at this point. We have had a lot of really, really great questions, but what I want to point out is that we are going to be talking winter birding next week, and so there are several questions that people posed that really were related to winter birding, and so we'll make sure that we have a chance to pull that information out as well. And while Elliot and I would love to go on because we could easily, you guys need to go to bed.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to go to work tomorrow. Please come back next week. Tell your friends. Thanks for being here with us. Take care, everybody.